Okay. Let me make this larger. Okay. I'm going to do chapter 4 of Sectarianization. I haven't done this in a long time because I've been incredibly sick of it, incredibly sick of sectarianization. Um, reading about it, talking about it, participating in it. I got very sick of that. But today felt like a good time to do chapter 4. So I'm going to attempt to do that. Let me see. To be fair, I do have a feeling I think this will be an interesting chapter, and I think I'll probably have a very hard time pronouncing everything. So that should be fun. Hopefully you can hear me because I'm not going to talk loudly today. So it's going to have to be good enough. Okay, let's see. So chapter 4 is a narrative identity approach to Islamic sectarianism. And to be fair, we've been talking mainly about politics until now. So this should be good. Okay. Adam Geiser. No, the text is still too small. Okay, there we go. Oh my gosh. In this chapter, I sketch smaller. Yeah. No, that's too big still. I sketch a methodological approach to what contemporary academics call sects, SECTS, denominations, and other kinds of intra-religious divisions amongst Muslims, and what Muslims of various epochs might call firaq, F-I-R-A-Q, nihal, tawa'if, or madhahib. I open by examining and ultimately rejecting dominant social science, specifically Weber-Trolitkian taxonomies of sect. Okay, so this guy with a complicated name has some ideas about sects as largely insufficient for the study of Muslim interreligious divisions, seeking in the second part of the chapter to replace such taxonomies with what will be called a narrative identity approach. Okay. So the author is essentially saying he is going to come up with his own framework to understand sects within Islam because he doesn't feel like what people use to classify sects in other religions are sufficient enough to accurately talk about it. This narrative identity approach orients the study of Muslim intra-religious divisions towards questions about how Muslims acquire, maintain, and manipulate their communal affiliations, the extent of which such affiliations might overlap with other kinds of affiliations or break down altogether, as well as the question of how local circumstances affect the, quote, activation of sect identification. Yeah, I mean, you do see that in different places around the world. when people of various religions move to different places, some of them become more religious, some become less, some assimilate more, some assimilate less. So, in attempting to answer such questions, the narrative identity approach to Islamic sectarianism treats intra-religious divisions as participatory discourses in which individuals ultimately choose to locate themselves in a plot, to quote, implot themselves. I've never heard that as a word. Or not to do so. Plot as a narrative. I think he's talking about plot as a narrative. So to put yourself into a story, essentially. Where was I? This is so annoying because, look, I'm reading it on my phone. And I have like the scrolling thing. And then I scroll and I lose my place. So, where was I? It's like very different than turning the page. Such a view, blah, blah, blah. Where was I? Blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay. To implot themselves. Okay. Individuals ultimately choose to locate themselves in a plot, to implot themselves, or not to do so, and which can thereby imply certain kinds of practice behavior. Such a view shifts the study of Islamic sectarianism, away from sect identification as an inherent aspect of religious identity, and towards sect identification as a dynamic and conscious process of adoption, maintenance, and manipulation of certain types of narrative identities in particular places and at particular times by particular persons or groups of persons. This is like a very general way of talking. I'm sure he'll get more specific later. Okay. Just because coming from a Jewish background where we have many, many sects as well, and there's a lot of complexity. If I was having a conversation about that, I would be using specific examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. Otherwise, it really sounds a little bit like gobbledygook. But I understand why he has to do this for an outsider, which I am to Islam, and I'm an outsider, so he has to lay the table before getting into specifics. The chapter concludes by offering some thoughts on how the narrative identity approach to Islamic sectarianism might bear on what the editors and authors of this volume have termed sectarianization. Cool. Okay. Taxonomies of sects. What does taxonomy mean? Branch of science concerned with classification. Oh, okay. Any discussion of intra-religious divisions amongst Muslims must begin, I believe, with the critical analysis of sectarianism as an academic field of inquiry, and end with evaluation of the extent to which this field may or may not apply to Muslim examples of categories similar to what the field defines as, quote, sects, denominations, and so on. Recent academic discussions about sectarianism can be said to begin with one of the founders of modern sociology, the German theorist Max Weber, who lived from 1864 to 1920. Weber interested himself in the study of human social behavior, its origins and development, organizations and institutions, and as an aspect of these concerned, offered the first sociological characterization of a sect. Okay, so Weber is the first one who came up with the idea of a sect, even though sects have been around since forever. Well, not the idea, he just named it, which he contrasted with institution of the church. Weber was interested in these institutions insofar as they provided ideal types, highlighted certain contrasting features of human social organization for the purposes of comparison. Specifically, Weber was interested in refuting Marx contention that social institutions were rooted in the economic substructure of society, aiming to show that religion could in fact operate as an independent variable in history. I mean, yeah, I don't see why not. For Weber, like, so many words. I don't mind a lot of words. I mind extra words. There's so many extra words in this chapter. For Weber, churches had certain features: professional priesthoods, dogmas and rites, claims to universal domination, and they were compulsory organizations, meaning that the church's claims to truth went beyond individuals, compelling it to discipline those who deviated from it. So that's a significant point. This last point on the mode of membership provided for Weber one of the main differences between churches and sects. People were born into churches, but they chose to be part of sects. Okay. This mode of membership thereby affected how a person acted in relation to the institution, and the church remained a, quote, compulsory association for the administration of grace, end quote. I mean, maybe at that time, church was compulsory. I'm looking at through modern eyes. So Weber lived in the 1800s. So and I don't know where he lived. Did they say Germany? I don't remember. I'm making that up. This mode of membership, compulsory, blah, blah, blah. While the sect offered a voluntary association for religiously qualified persons. Yeah, see, that's not my experience with sects at all. I don't think sects are necessarily voluntary. Some are. If you're not part of a sect, you can, in many cases, opt in. But if you're born into, there are many sects that if you're born into from a variety of religions that you can't really opt out of. But, okay. But then again, the meaning of words shift and change. So, okay. Sect thus rejected the institutionalized grace of the church for the personal salvation offered by the sect. This means that membership in the sect required specific actions, and unqualified members were removed from the group. Weber also claimed that sects resisted hierarchies, pointing to another difference that he postulated between a sect and a church. Churches are tied to the world and maintain hierarchies of individuals who dispense grace, while sects are generally apolitical and wish to be left alone. Okay, yeah, we're definitely talking about a different time. Weber's ideas were taken up and elaborated upon by his... Okay, I see why the author is saying that this is outdated. So, I mean, he's not disagreeing with me, but he's just laying out the foundation, even though it's changed. Weber's ideas were taken up and elaborated upon by his colleague and friend Ernst Troeltsch? I don't know. Troeltsch. Troeltsch. A hard name to pronounce. As a theologian, Troeltsch hoped to relate different kinds of religious experience to various kinds of social teaching, and to thereby discover a solution to the problems facing Christians in the modern era. He thus emphasized the social behavior of churches and sects over the particular form of social organization that they maintained. Churches, he argued, tended to accommodate the state, becoming in the process associated with the ruling class and thus part of the social order. Okay. This willingness to compromise with the world was predicated on the church's presumed ability to remain sanctified despite individual inadequacies. The sanctity of the church superseded the individual pieties of the persons that comprised it. Sects, on the other hand, aspire towards inward perfection and personal fellowship, treating the wider society sometimes with indifference and tolerance, but often with protest or open hostility. Indeed, for Troeltsch, the very values of the sect existed as a remonstration of those of the wider society. Remonstration. To make a forceful protest. Forceful, reproachful. Okay, to remonstrate is basically a protest. The very values of the sect existed as a remonstration of those of wider society. Oh, so he's saying that the sect exists literally to protest society, which is also why it doesn't get along with society as much as the church. Okay. He thus viewed sectarianism as something that existed among the lower classes and marginal social groups. For sect members, attainment of salvation existed in tension with secular interests and institutions. Thus, for Troeltsch, the church represented an institution of grace that was enmeshed in the wider world of politics and society, while the sect represented a smaller, voluntary group that stressed individual ethical behavior apart from the world. Weber and Troeltsch's typologies were heavily invested in the language and history of Christianity. Not only did they draw explicitly from the history of Catholic Protestant splits in Europe, but they both offered less a definition of church and sect than an attempt to establish these ideals as heuristic tools which would illuminate certain features of human social organization through comparison. Weber's aim in developing the typology was precisely to understand why capitalism and the idea of secular democracy seemed to develop only among Protestant Christians. For his part, Troeltsch hoped to find an answer to the problem of Christians' relation to the modern world. I think people are still looking for that. Concluding that because of its relation to society at large, the church offered the better solution. Weber and Troeltsch's church sect typology was itself then picked up by an American theologian, Helmut Richard Niebuhr, 1894 to 1962, who treated churches and sects as poles on a continuum rather than distinct categories. Niebuhr's insight was to show how sects tended to become more church-like with time, as new generations populated the sects and as their ways became fixed. Quote, the original impetus to reject the norms and activities of the dominant society, end quote, gave way to acceptance. The original impetus to reject norms and activities. Okay. So Niebuhr basically thinks that churches and sects are not two separate categories, they're a continuum, and that sects become like churches over time as the generations pass. Following Niebuhr, several contemporary sociologists and scholars of religion have offered elaborations of the church sect typology. Many of who have developed into full-fledged definitions of various church and sect types, creating what they called quasi-evaluative devices. I thought we were going to be talking about Islam. This is funny. I guess And we have to start with what came before that, which was Christianity. Thus, for example, Howard Becker expanded the church sect model to include denominations and ecclesia. Milton Yinger enlarged Becker's model even further. Oh my God, this is so boring. Posting 6 types: church, sect, established sect, class, church, denomination, ecclesia, and universal church. Subtype sects by their accepting, avoiding, or aggressive relationship to wider society. Similarly, Bent and Johnson classify religious groups according to their state of tension with the social environment. That's an interesting classification. That's much more interesting. Rodney Stark and William Sims, Bainbridge define churches as conventional religious organizations, sects as deviant religious organizations. I always thought in Judaism, from my experience, there's the religion of Judaism, and then we have sects that fall under the umbrella of Judaism. So that's my experience with the word religion and sect. I mean, here we're talking about church and sect, but church doesn't apply to Judaism. And we wouldn't talk about synagogue and sect because synagogue is just a vehicle for the religion and the sect. So not one-to-one comparisons here. But yeah. Blah, 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 blah. Opting for visual models, Roland Robertson and Paul Gustafson provided 2x2 tables. The cells with offered elaborations on the church and sect types using modified trolls, just whatever the guy criteria. William Swatos afforded a more elaborate table with 5 types. Who are these guys? Brian Wilson arguing among classic Weberian lines that religious groups should be understood according to their soteriological function. Doctrine of salvation, okay. Classed several types of sects according to their, quote, deviant responses to the world. Importantly, Wilson rejected the idea that sects must be set up against the church. Rather, they may be arrayed against, quote, secular society as a kind of protest movement. Just a side note, to identify your group or yourself in opposition of something else is, no offense, a really unintelligent thing to do, because then you never have your own identity. Your identity is only ever then predicated on someone else's identity. If the only thing you are is in opposition to. That's why the whole what's the best contemporary example of this is probably Jordan Peterson's ARC, which is defined in opposition to or as alternative of Klaus Schwab's Great Reset. So while I'm sure there's plenty of wonderful things happening with those folks at ARC, I personally think that there could be an issue with identification as opposed to, instead of looking inward and just figuring out what your actual identity is and what your values are. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So yes, this guy's saying, rather than what's weird, blah, blah, blah. Okay, because Wilson was saying that, this guy, that sects are basically an identity as opposed to the secular society. Albert Baumgarten similarly viewed sects primarily as protest groups, emphasizing the process of boundary creating by defining a sect as a, quote, voluntary association of protest, which utilizes boundary marking mechanisms. the social means of differentiating between insiders and outsiders, to distinguish between its own members and those otherwise normally regarded as belonging to the same national or religious entity. So that's interesting. I mean, you can see that from this perspective, it's less about religion and more about group identity and in-group and out-group identity. As becomes clear from a brief survey, which, by the way, isn't necessarily a bad thing inherently. I'm not saying that's bad. We're humans. That's what we do. We identify things with things and we disidentify with things. That's normal. As blah, 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 as becomes clear from a brief survey of the various sociologists. I'm tired. It's pretty late here, and I have to go to sleep soon. Sociologists and religious studies scholars who developed the Weber, Troeltsch, Niebuhr church sect and later cult typology. The notion of, quote, sect and sectarianism. Oh my gosh. I really am tired. Because it took me this far into the chapter to realize that we were talking about sect in relation to sectarianism. Because the first 4 letters of sectarianism is sect. And that's where it came from. Oh my God, I'm so tired. Okay. Obviously. That's what's it. Okay. Wow. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, to be fair to me, it's been a few months, but still. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see if I can finish the chapter before I go to sleep. Is it a lot? Oh, man. Okay, I'll try. Let's see. I can always do 2 parts. Oh, I went too far. See, there's no page numbers. So now that I've lost my place, where was I? Oh, here we are. Okay. Blah, 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 may be differentiated from other kinds of groups according to an array of diverse criteria. Broadly speaking, however, there's a consensus among them, all these guys, Weber, Troeltsch, and Niebuhr, that a sect is, quote, a group that has separated to some degree from a parent body and has boundary markers to indicate its separate identity. It seems fair. Yeah. I think that's a good definition of sect. Lost in translation. This is another section in the same chapter. Given this broad consensus among this previous generation of academics, it's worth asking how applicable their conceptualizations of, quote, sect and sectarianism might be for the study of Muslim sects, Firak. Michael Cook has argued that Weber's notion of church sect is, in fact, not very useful when carried over into the Islamic context. For one, Islamic sectarianism proper was first and foremost a response to the religio-political developments after the death of Prophet Muhammad, while Weber and Troeltsch, amongst others, characterized sects as apolitical. Secondly, membership in what might be considered a Muslim sect. Isn't the Vatican political? I don't know. Isn't that? Anyway. Secondly, membership in what might be considered a Muslim sect, notably the Shia, but also the Ib- Ib- Ibadiyya, is no more voluntary than that of other Muslim groups. And lastly, Shia possess far more hierarchical characteristics than their Sunni counterparts, making them more properly the candidates for Weber's status of church than Sunnis, upon whom Weber actually bestowed the designation. Okay. Given these problems, Cook concluded that Weber is neither so obviously right nor so interestingly wrong as to provide a useful starting point for our own attempts to understand the peculiar groups we know as Islamic sects. He calls, that's funny. He's not shy, he just calls them peculiar. Similarly, many of the definitions of sect and sectarianism that follow Weber turn out to be fundamentally problematic when applied to the Islamic context. Yeah, because you're not talking about the same thing. That's like what I said about Judaism. You cannot copy and paste Christian sects to Jewish sects to Muslim sects. It just doesn't work. You're fundamentally not talking about the same things. There may be similarities, there may be cross sections, but they are not the same frameworks fundamentally, because they're all fundamentally different religions. Okay. I mean, this just seems to me like, I mean, I'm going through it, so it's not a waste of time, but I mean this a little hyperbolically. It seems like a waste of time to look at something that's already established and try to fit it into the framework of something else. Just look at it for what it is and define it. Just find its own taxonomy. You don't need to fit it into, I don't know. Anyway. I can't talk to Weber because he's been gone for 100 years. So, one of the main issues he's talking about when applying the Islamic context to Weber's definition of sex to Islamic context revolves around this notion of church denomination or ecclesia as somehow set around against sects and cults. While a case, however long-winded, can be made for treating Shia and perhaps more appropriately Kharijites, a sect in the Weber Troelstian vein, there is no good candidate for what in the early Islamic period might qualify as the church denomination or ecclesia from which they separated. Something called Sunnism cannot be said to have existed before the 9th century, and the pro-Uthman groups of the early period, mainly the Umayyads, which was 661 to 750 CE, constituted no majority, nor were they as firmly established in their rules as they might have liked to have been, as the relentless history of rebellion against them shows. Certainly, the Umayyads attempted to make themselves into the undisputed popular religious authorities of the early Islamic period, but such attempt failed resoundingly, as did the later Abbasid efforts to do the same, which was around 750 CE to 1258 CE. At best, these early groups might simply qualify as other Muslim sects. None of them meet the requirements for churches or parent groups. This is, I don't like this conversation. Makes no sense to me. Just create unique categories. It's like trying to fit a triangle into a circle. What is the point? Even Wilson's definition, this conversation is probably like the definition of like intellectual Orientalism, where everything has to be seen through the lens of Christianity, or in this case, Christianity. Orientalism would be the West, but I'm so bored of it. Okay. Even blah blah blah. Wilson's definition of sect. I mean, he may do something at the end of the chapter, which he says, "Oh, the whole 2/3 of the first part of the chapter I didn't like, and here's a good answer for you." He may do that, and I'll be happy. So, but we'll see. Okay, so even, I mean, he is saying what I'm saying. He's saying, look, this is what all these guys said about Christianity. Here's why Islam doesn't fit, but it's so redundant. Even Wilson's definition of sect, which hopefully leaves aside overt notions of church, nonetheless posits sects as protest movements, and devious ones at that, to be measured against the societies in which they are located. In effect, Wilson simply substitutes society for church as the normative baseline against which sects may be classed. This is not to say that what early Muslims later dubbed Firaq sects were not protest movements within the midst of their societies. Initially, many of them were, but simply to point out that the yardstick for measuring protest need not be a real or imagined universal, such as church, denomination, ecclesia, or society. Defining sects as deviant in relation to some universal, in fact, subtly replicates the historical situation of the early Christian church, revealing it to be hiding under such definitions all along. The early Islamic situation seems rather to be one of several groups competing for primacy. And mutually protesting or indeed actively rebelling against each other. There seems to be no center, no parent group or normative society from which these groups sprang and against which they define themselves. Moreover, while many of the Firaq, the sects, the Islamic sects, were at some point and to a certain degree voluntary in the heavily tribalized societies of the early Islamic period, voluntarism was quickly omitted. Okay, yeah, I assume that's what it meant. Basically taken away with tribal associations such that sect and tribal affiliation could be frequently correlated. And while most of the groups that were later described as Firaq initially arose in protest against the Umayyads, by the Abbasid era, one of them, and the Morgia, abandoned any vestige of revolutionary protest to be eventually absorbed into the emerging Sunni consensus. Clearly, the analytical church sect cult categories discussed above are not much help in characterizing early interreligious divisions amongst Muslims. That's exactly what I just said. Indeed, turning to the ways that early, so I mean, he's on board with me, but could have said that in like a few less pages. Indeed, turning to the ways that early Muslims conceptualized the religious subgroups in their midst, it's noteworthy that they tended not to use binary, tertiary, or relational terminology, such as cult, sect, church, sect, cult, or sect denomination, but rather to abstract to the main group using a singular concept. Thus, the various terms approximated the idea of sect in the Islamic world: firqa, firaq, nila, nihal, madhab, and madhahib, and later taifa and tawaif tend to eventually designate Shia, Kharijites, Murjia, Mutazila, as well as those later known under the rubric of Sunnis. This is not to say that individual Muslim authors treated these groups as equally legitimate. They most certainly did not, but merely pointing out that the conceptual schema underlying the Muslim imaginary of sectarianism tended to deploy one notion to describe various kinds of groups, while Christians and later Western academic notions seem to replicate what is at its base a dualistic or a what the heck is this word? Tripartite, consisting of three parts. Just say consisting of three parts. Oh my God. Tripartite? Okay. It's hard not to trip on that word. Even when medieval Muslim authors, that was so bad. Even when they designated one group as superior to the others, they tended to cite the prophetic hadith that mentioned the, quote, saving sect, which is al-Firqa al-Najiyah, among the other deviant or heretical firaq, yet casting them all together as firaqs. Despite the serious shortcomings of the church sect typology for the study of Muslim intra-religious divisions, there remain some elements of these theories that might be rescued. First, Weber and later Wilson approached religion in terms of its function, highlighting how religious groups such as churches and sects offer distinctive group paths to salvation. They therefore thereby distinguish sects by their soteriological, use that word, the doctrine of salvation. That's what that word means. They distinguish their sects by the doctrine of salvation of that sect. So, like, do you believe in the Trinity? Do you not believe in the Trinity? All this stuff. Well, no, does that have to do with salvation? I don't know. I don't know. It's too late. Blah, blah, blah. They distinguish by the ways that their answers to the question, what should we do to be saved? Right, salvation implied certain kinds of relation to their social environment. Okay. While I do not wish to reduce religion or sectarianism to its function alone, I do hold that the idea of salvation remains a central leitmotif. That's a recurring theme for Muslim intra-religious divisions, and their so their philosophy on salvation might provide an important means to distinguish between them. Yeah, probably. Especially when it comes to like topics of jihad and so on, obviously. Second, returning in some senses to Weber's notion of the, quote, mode of membership in the church or sect, it is possible to see past his particular characterization of members being born into churches, but choosing sects towards the most interesting question of how human beings participate in religious groups and subgroups. More recent definitions of sectarianism view it as both a practice and a discourse, calling attention to how sectarian affiliation must be, quote, activated if it is to move from being passive or banal to being assertive or even aggressive. Just getting flashbacks to the beginning of the war. Because how they're talking about sectarianism here, about all these ideas about salvation and belief, that's very nice. And there's a good point to that. But I was just thinking to like mid last year or early last year and all the sectarian violence that we had in this region and what that looked like and how different people identified with different I don't know if I would call them sects, but particularly in Syria. I mean, that's the most interesting example. The violence on the coast, the Druze, the mustaches, all of that stuff, how people identified with sect. Okay. And more recent definitions of sectarianism viewed it as both a practice and a discourse, calling attention to how sectarian affiliations must be activated if it is to move from being passive or banal to being assertive or even aggressive. So the idea of sects and sectarianism being activated is interesting in politics because different actors will activate different sentiments among sects. To cause certain outcomes. So you can have a larger group that doesn't identify with smaller sects, but they do have characteristics of smaller sects, but they largely on a day-to-day basis identify with the larger group. But if you activate the identification with the smaller sects over the larger group, it's very easy to incite violence. So that's what I saw a lot of last year. And I don't know, maybe it's happening now. I'm just not paying attention. Calling attention to how sectarian affiliation must be activated if it's to move from being passive or banal to being assertive or even aggressive. I mean, there's this activation you can also see in UK society, for example, with the Black Lives Movement situation a couple of years ago, where that wasn't, as far as I'm aware, really part of the discourse in the UK, but it was imported and activated, I would say, prior to the BLM nonsense. When I talk to people in the UK, they would get very confused about identity politics in the United States, particularly race politics. They're like, oh, we don't have that here. After the BLM movement moved to the UK, I don't hear people saying we don't have that here anymore. I hear them like getting really riled up about it. So that's sad. But that's also an activation, a completely unnecessary and what's the word? Manufactured activation. It's manufactured, but what you're awakening is visceral, and that's why it's so effective. Because in a way, sectarianism is tribal in nature. At least I'm making that claim. Thus, sectarian affiliation in Iraqi society of the early 1950s and 60s might be characterized as largely passive or banal. Iraq's dominant political discourse was one of Baathism, socialism that downplayed, for the most part, religious and sectarian affiliations as modes of social identification. However, several factors, historical, social, and economic, gradually activated sectarian identification in Iraqi society to the point that such affiliations more and more became nodes of potential and actual violence. Those factors included, but aren't limited to, the Iranian Revolution of 1978 to 1979, that pitted a revolutionary vision of Shia-inspired Islamic government against Saddam Hussein's secular nationalist totalitarianism, the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq, in which Saddam treated Shia as a fifth column, the 1991 Gulf War, with its doomed Shia uprising in southern Iraq, the 2003 US invasion and occupation of Iraq, and the rise of various Sunni and Shia militias who were in large part supported by surrounding countries who like to play innocent about that. We discussed that in previous chapters. Discourse-based conceptualizations. It's so funny how, never mind. Discourse-based conceptualizations of sectarian identification thus point to the importance of external influences, economics, and shifting notions of modernity and nationalism, as well as to history, myths, and symbols as factors that create and sustain sectarianism in modern contexts. They challenge researchers to move away from treating sectarianism as a thing in itself, and therefore from relying on taxonomies of church sect cult types and back to sectarianism as a way of doing things, as a mode of being in the world, and as a discourse of identification. Okay. Let's see. Okay. There's one more there's one more section in this chapter. It's titled, where did it go? A narrative identity approach to Muslim sects and schools. I'm way too tired to read through that now. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go to sleep, and I will do a part 2 for chapter 4 another time. But with this first half of the chapter as a foundation, that should probably be somewhat interesting. Yeah, see, I'm tempted, but no, I'm way too tired. And I do want to have enough focus so that I can actually take in what the chapter is saying. And I'm not going to be able to do that now. So thank you all, and have a good day, evening, night, afternoon, wherever you are. Oh, look at that. There are people in the comments. Let me see who is here. Okay, let's get rid of this creepy person, ban user, and delete their comments. Paul is here. Hi, Paul. Long time no speak. It's a pleasure to see you. What a treat. How exciting. You came for an appropriate chapter where it's talking all about church and sects and Christianity. Okay, let's see what Paul has to say. Normally I just close this and go straight to bed, but if you've taken all this time to write, let's see what your comments have to say, Paul. The definition of church is pretty broad. I would agree. The Roman Catholic Church is one, and there were periods of where, quote, everyone, like the Irish, were all defined by Catholic. Part of what develops is the invention of the individual. Oh, that makes sense. Templar UK is here. Hi. Call it in, get some rest. Yeah, you said that half an hour ago. I am going to do that right now. all that Protestant history is very different from RC, Ortho, or Islamic or Jewish Protestants, especially after America fundamentally challenged the imaginary. Yeah, yeah. And also keep in mind, Paul, that this book, if you're still there, lost sound? Oh, you muted. Okay, it just scared me. This book is about, it's a little over a decade old. And since it's talking about religion and politics, it's interesting and there's a lot of value in it, but there are some things that the world has changed a lot in 10 years. So there's a lot more that could be added. Why did I pick this book? Mainly because I'm living in the Middle East and witnessing and unfortunately also at times participating in sectarianism, which has a tendency to get violent, which is sometimes or often used as a weapon of war, as a weapon for politicians against, like using citizens as a tool to achieve political gains. And so pitting different sects against each other, whether it's, you know, in the case of, like I mentioned earlier, Syria last year, it was like Druze against Sunnis in Syria. We had a lot of violence, a couple of, like over 1,000 people died. Whether it's, if we're talking about sectarianism here in Israel, amongst the various countries, I mean, one of the massive underlying issues here in the Middle East is sectarianism. Whether it's coming from bubbling up from a sort of natural tribal place amongst people, or whether it's being used as a tool of manipulation of the masses, which I think there's a lot more here, and then the visceral reaction sort of takes it. Sectarianism is not something I want to, that I enjoy, that I want to participate in, that I want to understand. Well, I do want to understand it now, but it's not a natural subject for me. But finding myself in the midst of it, I really wanted to understand the Middle East more, and I suppose, as we all do, like my own place in it. And so this book has been somewhat helpful in that regard, getting a little bit deeper into the history of the Middle East and the role that sectarianism has played in the various wars and conflicts and movements of people, mainly in the last century. Mainly because the conflict that's affected my life the most is the one here in Israel, which it's largely just been the issue I have is largely in the last century. Okay, I'm exhausted. I'm explaining too much. Dust, is very nice to see you. Yes, I send psychic. What's the word I'm looking for? Psychic telepathy to the algorithm. I don't. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think sect is the right word either. In Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses are a sect. No, Paul, what the heck? No, it's cinnamon. I have a cinnamon stick, and then I've got cloves. Yeah, I could see why it would look like cigarette butts. It's cloves. I put in some cayenne pepper and a little bit of lemon, and I forgot to put in honey, but that's okay. There were protests against the Vietnam War in the UK. Even though the UK wasn't part of the war, people longed to participate in meaning. Yes. If I could frame that comment, I would. It's about cohering a group, tell the CIA. Grim, good to see you. We did have a conversation, yeah. Popular belief is cultural in many ways. Yeah, Paul, I'm doing a public service for people who have insomnia and they can't fall asleep. All right. Okay, let's see. Okay. Paul has been reading, you've been reading The Making of the Arab World by Gerhays? History in Egypt of the 20th Century. That does sound very interesting. Huh. Okay. Yes. Yes, cloves is much better. It's so... I've recently, like literally only just this week, started putting cloves in my tea. And I really like it. Like I really, really like it. It does get annoying when you're drinking and then one of them floats to the top. But you know, so is life. All right then. Thank you everyone for your time and attention. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.